Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of DEI After 5. Now, if you have worked with me or if you have followed me for any time, you know that I am a huge champion for DEI being all inclusive, right? It's not just about your employees, but it's also about who you reach outside of your organization, your clients, your customers, the community, the environment around you. And so today we are going to talk about this DEI 2.0, this next level of diversity and inclusion, because this is where organizations really need to be honing in on. And so my guest today is Jessica Bantam. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sacha. Great to be here.
So for those that may not know who you are or what you do, can you give us a little bit of insight into Jessica?
Sure. So I am a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging consultant and also an interior design consultant. And I recently merged those two backgrounds in my book, Design for Identity, which really explores the importance of having conversations about cultural identity in the design process, both with customers and among design teams.
I love it. I am a huge, what I call HGTV, geek. So I'm I love design, but I know my limitations and I'm gonna stick over here. So leave that for you. So, how did you decide to merge these two together, right? Because when we think about, at least when I think about design and I think about it in the corporate setting, right? I'm really thinking about product design or, things that are more in that space for our customers, right? When I think about interior design, I think about my home. I think about, or places and spaces, right, that you're creating. And so as a DEI consultant doing this work, how did you merge those together? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I have a background specifically in interior design, but I've had exposure to other disciplines of design throughout my career, including product design, as you mentioned, by being in the design thinking space. As well as graphic design and my work doing marketing and communications. So it's always been part of what I do, even though my career path has been split essentially along these two paths, one being management consulting and the other being an interior design consulting. But in the evolution of my management consulting career, I pivoted to DEI around 2019. And it was interesting because the more that I dug into DEI and what it means and its implications, it made me look at design differently. I started really thinking about how we didn't intentionally address identity in design education. And we weren't taught to do that either in the practice of design. And when you look at something as intimate as interior design, where, just like you're engaging with customers in their homes, if you're a residential designer, or even outside of residential design, you are designing around and for people.
Yeah.
So to avoid identity just didn't seem to make sense. And I honestly, I don't know what took it so long for me to kind of make that connection myself. But like I said, it was that intense dive into DEI that really made me start reevaluating the design process itself and what we were doing and what outcomes we were creating.
So give me some examples of what that would look like, kind of in real time, right? And again, I will leave it to you to determine kind of the space, but what does that look like? Because I think for so many people, when they think of, at least when I think of, being intentional about that design, certain images come to my mind about those spaces. So talk to me about what that looks like.
Yeah, and I'll share specifically in the context of interior design. Oftentimes, what I have seen in terms of what was meant to be representative of culture in spaces was often very cliche. there's been a lot of cultural appropriation in the context of interiors, because there are certain maybe motifs that come to mind, certain symbols, certain graphic patterns that designers, I think represent different cultural backgrounds or different notions of culture. And often that reads as very performative, and it completely falls flat with the people that they are supposedly intending to honor or represent. So that is, just seeing that happen in many spaces, and I'm sure some of us can actually visualize some of those spaces and instances on our own from our own past experience, especially in workplaces when it comes time for cultural observances. Just in many, many places. So that is something that we need to be able to address. And it's something that even I, as an interior designer, have started addressing more deliberately with my own customers. I've started asking them the question, what about your identity would you like to see celebrated in this space? And it's funny because I think it kind of takes them off guard at first, because this isn't a normal design conversation. For a lot of us, it's not a normal conversation, period, for a stranger to ask us about what's relevant to us about our cultural identity. But it also just opens the doors for such meaningful connection and conversation. And it gives, I know in those instances, it gave me as a designer some really critical insight to really customize the space and really make it someplace that the homeowners really felt like represented them, and to do that in ways that really resonated and honored the identities that they chose to share.
Absolutely. The coach in me, when you asked that question, what about your identity do you want to celebrate in this space? I had to write it down, because that's a powerful question, because it really forces people to think authentically. It connects emotionally, like, how do you want to celebrate your identity here? And what does that look like? And it can be very challenging, because so many people may have not really thought about what that looks like authentically.
Right.
The flip side of that is, as you were talking, I kind of chuckled, because when you said, the cultural celebrations, and it's the throwing up of the kente cloth on everything in February, right? And I'm just like, really? Like,
exactly.
come on now, we can do more than that.
We can
We can do, but that's what it is, right? It's making sure that it's authentic. It's making sure, that again, mud cloth, that's another one that comes up quite a bit, where it's like, oh yeah, let's just throw that up there. And for some people, there's absolutely no connection to it, or the design, or anything. And so I think that what you've said is so powerful, because it pulls in that authenticity. It pulls in what is true to you.
Right. And I'm sure we're about to see it again with Juneteenth coming up. And that's actually what I reference in my book. That was another trigger for writing the book in the first place. Seeing how Juneteenth was first, I guess, observed on a national level back in 2021, and seeing products from stores that had sayings like, it's the culture for me.
Oh, yes.
It's the freedom for me. What? And, to have themed ice cream flavors for Juneteenth. Is that what we're really doing? So,
I did a whole show on that. A whole show. Yes.
Right. Yeah. And we have to address these things, because what I think is often happening is these concepts are being developed in a bubble, usually with a very homogenous group of designers, which is to be expected. I mean, you look at design disciplines as a whole, they're overall like 90% white, which is another reason I felt that this book was necessary, and also why we need to start the conversation in design education, because we're not engaging, we're not even acknowledging the impacts of what that proportion means in terms of what we're creating. I mean, if you look at that, design is inherently performative, because there's no way that the profession is mirroring the identities of the people that we are serving.
Absolutely. And it's so powerful, again, because the word authenticity just keeps coming up for me, and not checking boxes, right? Let's not just throw this up here and say, yep, we checked the box. We've represented for Juneteenth or for Black History Month or even Asian Pacific, Islander Month, like whatever the month or the occasion is. My question always is, how do you continue this after these 30 days, right? How do you continue this so that it's authentic, but then now it's a part of the cultural fabric of the organization. It's not something that's coming across as performative because it's part of the everyday design, right? It's being intentional about what these spaces look like every single day, where people feel represented regardless of their identity.
Exactly. And that authenticity is key. That's actually part of the subtitle of my book, is How to Design Authentically for a Diverse World. And the intention of the Design for Identity Blueprint, which I introduce in the book, which is essentially just an evolved version of the standard design process, it incorporates questions to ask customers throughout the design process. So, you don't wait until you have a 90% complete product at the end and then call in a focus group and act like, even act like you're going to be able to make changes at that point, or that you're willing to. It's about starting the conversation from the very beginning, and then also intentionally creating opportunities throughout the process to go back and validate, and for designers to be willing to pivot if they've gotten things wrong, or they just haven't gotten things, exactly right. And just having that willingness to also have conversations among your design team to say, do we have the right people in the room on our side to be engaging in an authentic way with these customers, to make sure that we are honoring them in this process and also in the final solution.
Yeah. This reminds me so much. When I was leading a team of doing inclusion marketing, and we would have to do events, exactly what you said is like, do we have the right people at the table? And if we don't, do we have access to those voices that aren't at the table, so that we can kind of pass this through as we're going through the process, right? Not at the end where we're like, hey, here's the event, tell me what you think, and we've already built it.
Exactly.
And so that forced us to rethink, even the types of tables and chairs that we had in a space. Making sure that we can do things that wheelchairs could easily access, right? So ramps were a part of that whole design of the event, right? That particular space. And so what I think is critical in this, Jessica, and it goes back to what you're saying, when you talk about like design, it's not just interior or event, like it's all of the things that we design. It's all of those tangible, almost an intangible, places and spaces that ask for inclusion, right? That ask for us to be intentional in who is the audience and who could be missing out when we present it in this particular way.
Exactly. And it just, the concepts apply across any discipline and any profession. You mentioned coaching. I have a coaching colleague who read my book, and now she has incorporated a question into her discovery calls, asking clients, is there anything about your identity you think I should know as your coach, to make sure that we, that this experience is meaningful to you. This could apply in the context of any kind of design, experience design. You look at, I've spoken with HR professionals, and they are essentially the crafters of an experience, the employee experience.
Yeah.
This concept applies there. You have to really be aware of the identities of the people that you are serving to make sure that you are honoring them in the process. And absolutely. I mean, this could apply to education, could apply to consulting. As I mentioned, I've been a consultant for years. And there have been many instances where if we had just had an honest conversation and put everything on the table about identities with the customers, and then also, like you mentioned, if we had been willing to go outside of our initial design, our design team or our project team, and say, maybe in this instance, we just need to ask somebody else for their perspectives. We just need to be open to having that conversation and not feeling like we have to figure it out on our own, and that as the designers or the owners of this process, we have to figure it all out and have all the answers. There's plenty of people around us. That's one of the benefits of having, especially working in a diverse organization.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would even caveat that even if you're not in a diverse organization, there are resources out there that can support you to create more inclusive workplaces and spaces, but that requires that cultural humility and humbleness to say, we don't know. And we want to learn, but we'll give, this has been my phrase all day today, grace and space, right? We're going to give you the grace and the space to be able to do that. And so that I think is so essential as a part of this process too, because it's iterative as well, right? You're going to constantly learn. You're going to constantly grow. No one's ever going to be a pure expert or get it 100% right every time, right? You're going to constantly have to evolve and shift and tweak and change. The other thing that you said that I think is so important is, sometimes we think about, okay, how do we design for the team that we have, or, the folks, our current customers, but how do you design for the folks that you don't even know about yet? Right. And so that's where that inclusion piece becomes so important, because you may pull in more customers, more clients that didn't have access to you because it wasn't inclusive to them. And so how do you think about who's not at the table or who we not considering in this process so that we can bring them in as well too?
And asking those questions is a competitive advantage for all organizations. And having that cultural competence, that awareness of other identities, and that willingness to be vulnerable, that willingness to say, I don't know, but then also coupled with that willingness to explore, that willingness to access all of the information that's available to us. That's one thing. Nobody can say that there's not information out there right now. We can get to anything about everything.
Right.
So just being willing to lean into that, and also take that a step further, being willing to believe what we find, and not feeling that we need to edit it to make us comfortable or to make it make sense to us as individuals. We have to be willing to embrace the realities of different people and their lifestyles.
Even if it makes us uncomfortable. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, all of that. So, what you're talking about is really a design philosophy. Like, how do you create a philosophy on inclusion in the work that you do? So what are, and not to give away all the secrets and sauce in the book, but what are some ways, like one or two questions that organizations can ask themselves or think about as they're creating this design philosophy for themselves?
Well, that's a really great question. And there's actually, there are two exercises in the last chapter of the book that give individual designers an opportunity to reflect on these things, as well as design leaders, and what they want their firm's philosophy to be about inclusion. And one thing that I ask is, what do you want your legacy to be as a designer? I think there's a lot of good intention in the world. And I think that since the summer of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, which, it triggered so much for so many people, I think the intention is there, but we're not all going about things to make an impact. We're not all taking the action to make a real impact for people who have historically been excluded. But adopting these culturally competent design practices is a way to do that. It is a way to move the mark. It is a way to honor identity. It is a way to include in a way that is meaningful to the people that you are looking to include. So that would be one question is, like I said, what do you want your legacy to be as a designer? And then also to evaluate maybe what makes you resistant to exploring this. Which, I mean, and plenty of people could react to these questions in, as many ways as there are individuals, because there are so many things that make up our experience, so many things that have informed our bias, so many layers of our own individual identities. And I think that people are often challenged when the subject of identity comes up, because you can't talk about someone else's identity without reflecting on your own.
Ooh.
So there's a lot to reconcile and work through, but we have to do that in order to bring about, like I said, meaningful outcomes for people who have historically been excluded.
Yes, that last part that hit me, because one of the exercises that I do in one of the sessions is providing people with the identity iceberg,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the question that I ask them is, well, the task that I provide them is pull 5 of those identities from the iceberg that are most important to you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting for me to watch people struggle with that because they've never had to think about it. Right? Or they've thought about, okay, this 1 or 2 identities, but these other ones, like, this is who I am. This is how I operate in the world. And to face that, right? You cannot, and that's exactly what you just said. You can't think about anybody else's identity and how to deal with that until you have done that work yourself. It's that internal work. And what are you grappling and struggling with? Or what are you denying of yourself?
Very true. Very
right?
true.
In that process.
Yes,
Because that's a whole story.
It's a whole thing, especially for people with lived experience. Sometimes our frame of reference is only those things. So we, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation are probably the major things that come to people's mind when we talk about cultural identity. But we are so much more than those things. And often for people who have been marginalized, what has made us in that place of being marginalized about our identity is often the only thing we focus on ourselves, or the things that we've been programmed to focus on, those labels that we have embodied and that have just kind of seared into our minds about who we are, and then we neglect everything else about what makes us us.
Yeah, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
We're so blinded by our privilege
Also true. Yep.
that we don't understand how those identities provide privileges to us.
Exactly.
Right. And so it's this interesting dance. And I often share, yes, I am a Black female, right, which carries some challenges with it, but I'm also able-bodied. And so how do I lean into that privilege? And what am I not seeing because of that? Right. And so it's those areas, like our gaps that we don't see. And so when we're thinking about design, or we're thinking about inclusion and what that looks like, we have to look at our own gaps and things we take for granted, and so it's all tied together. It's absolutely tied together. So, Jessica, I'm going to ask you this question, because I ask all of my guests this question. What do you do to fill your cup? Like, what do you do to take care of yourself as you're doing this work?
Well, I have to say, I have had to become a lot more intentional about paying attention to this. So I'm glad you're asking the question. Because honestly, since I got into DEI work, I've had to be way more intentional about this. One of the things that actually helps fill me back up is connecting with other DEI practitioners. I actually lead a monthly practitioner power hour the first Friday of every month, and just create a space for other DEI practitioners to get together for us to just share our experiences, but also to uplift each other and have this intentional opportunity to remind ourselves of why we're doing what we're doing. And being able to connect in that way is just, I can't even really put it into words. And it's been a great community. And there have been great connections that have been formed in that space. And everybody knows you can just come and show up however you show up, wherever you are in that moment. That's just where you are. If it's too much for you to keep talking about it, skip it this month. That's fine. But we need those spaces, especially when so many of us do this work either individually or in very small teams. It's just nice to have that space to connect.
Absolutely. So where could folks find you if they are interested in getting the book, getting to know you, joining the community, like all the things? Where can they find you?
Well, the best place is my website, jessicabantam.com. But I am also active on LinkedIn. If you send me a request, but I'll gladly accept. I'd love to connect there as well. And I'm also on Instagram at Jessica Bantam. So those are the best places. And yeah, and I genuinely look forward to connecting with people. I know some people are like, yeah, send me your request. Yeah, good to know you. I really do. And, I enjoy engaging. I enjoy getting feedback. I enjoy learning from other people. So I'm not just giving this lip service.
Absolutely. I can attest to that. Jessica's great. All right. Well, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us today. I think you have provided us, I call them nuggets, like just so many nuggets of things to think about, because again, when we are designing, regardless kind of the space, we have to be intentional. And I really think that if we're not incorporating DEI as a part of that, we're missing out, because we're missing customers, we're missing clients, we're missing potential employees, because we have to truly be inclusive, and do so authentically. So thank you for all of your nuggets, because again, I think this is where we need to go. These are the conversations we need to have in this space, and it goes beyond just unconscious bias training. Like, this is, well, I'm calling that 2.0, that next level of this work. So Jessica, thank you so much for being with us today. And everyone, thank you so much for joining this episode of DEI After 5. You can catch us every Tuesday at 5:15 p.m. on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, do all of the things. And until next time, have a good one.